Let me tell you something, boss. There's a specific kind of quiet that only lives 6 feet under the concrete of a county morgue, and it ain't peaceful. It's heavy. It smells like a bad mix of formalin, damp lime wash, and the sour rust of 80-year-old drainage pipes. It was November 1974, out in rural Illinois. Outside, a brutal autumn storm was ripping through the cornfields, throwing buckets of freezing rain against the small, ground-level windows of the municipal basement. The power grid in this county was a joke, boss. The overhead fluorescent tubes had flickered and died 2 hours ago with a sharp, electric pop, leaving me down there with nothing but a single, brass oil lantern sitting on the edge of the zinc prep table. My name is Arthur, and at 28, while most guys my age were out in Chicago driving muscle cars or drinking draft beer, my hands were covered in wax-stiff linen and heavy post-mortem thread. I was the shroud stitcher. The medical examiners, they do the clean work, boss. They slice, they weigh the organs, they write their dry little bureaucratic reports, and then they leave. But when a body is completely torn apart by a steering column or harvested by a train, someone's gotta put the puzzle back together so the family doesn't lose their minds at the open casket wake. That was my job. I sat in the dark with massive, curved steel needles and thick, coarse flax thread, sewing up the deep Y incisions and reattaching cold, gray skin to cold, gray muscle. The yellow flame of the oil lantern was dancing, casting long, geometric shadows against the sweating brick walls. Every time the wind howled upstairs, the draft would find its way down the elevator shaft, making the lantern hiss and smoke. Just 3 more hours, Arthur, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding flat and dry in the empty vault. On the table in front of me lay Jane Doe number 44. They'd found her 6 hours ago out in the deep woods near the Blackwater Ravine. The police report said it was a hit and run, but looking at the skin, my gut told me something else entirely, boss. She was a young woman, maybe 25, but her flesh had been completely filleted, deep, precise, vertical lacerations running from her collarbone all the way down to her hip joints. The lacerations didn't look like they were made by a car chassis. They looked like something had tried to unzip her from the inside out. I dipped my curved needle into a jar of carbolic disinfectant, the steel making a sharp clink against the glass. I pulled a long strand of the flax thread, waxing it down with a block of tallow until it was stiff enough to pierce leather. The rain outside hit a sudden, violent cadence, a heavy thud-thud-thud against the dirt window that sounded like bare hands trying to claw through the glass. The lantern flame shrank to a tiny blue bead, and the smell of old wood smoke and wet carbolic wash filled the small radius of my workspace. I pressed my thumb against the edge of Jane Doe's sternum, aligning the cold, gray borders of the skin. I raised the needle, aiming for the top of the chest incision right beneath her throat. Pierce. Pull. Knot. The coarse thread made a dry, scraping shuck-shuck sound as it dragged through the dead fat layer. Her skin was unusually tough, thick as cured leather, and it didn't give like normal post-mortem tissue. It felt like it was under some kind of deep, internal static tension. I finished the first 3 stitches, cutting the knot with my steel shears. The sound of the blades echoed, snip. I paused. The room went completely dead silent, save for the steady dripping of condensation from the main return valve over the coal bin. I leaned over the table to adjust the lantern wick, my face just inches away from Jane Doe's open mouth. And that's when I heard it, boss. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't the wind in the pipes. From deep inside her empty, hollowed-out thoracic cavity, beneath the layers of wet linen I'd used to pack her rib cage, a faint, wet, obstructed breath escaped her lips. It was a slow, sibilant hiss-shuck that smelled heavily of dry autumn leaves and stagnant river water. I froze, boss. My hand stayed locked in mid-air, the curved steel needle hovering just 3 inches above Jane Doe's collarbone. The oil lantern gave a sudden, erratic spit, the yellow light jumping against the damp brick wall and making her shadow look like it was sitting up on the zinc table. I leaned closer, my heart slamming a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I stared at her blue, cold lips. There was nothing. Just the dry, rigid line of a mouth that hadn't spoken a word in 48 hours. "Get a grip, Arthur," I whispered, the cold air turning my words into a small, gray cloud that drifted over the corpse. "It's just trapped gas." The diaphragm settling. It happens. Every medical textbook says the same thing: when the muscles relax and the cooling process hits the internal organs, the residual air inside the pulmonary trunk vents itself. It's basic biology. It's mechanical. But a machine doesn't smell like dry autumn leaves. A machine doesn't smell like the rotting floorboards of a house that burned down 20 years ago. I shook my head, wiped the cold sweat from my forehead with the back of my sleeve, and gripped the heavy flax thread again. The storm outside gave a massive, concussive rumble, a low-frequency thunder vibration that shook the jars of formaldehyde on the shelves. The oil lamp flickered, its flame drowning in the rising humidity of the basement. I set the skin borders again, forcing the curved needle through the dead tissue right at the center of her chest. Asterisk pierce. Pull. Not asterisk. But this time, when I pulled the flax string to lock the stitch, the thread didn't tighten against the flesh. It kept going. I pulled it 6 inches, 8 inches, a foot, but the slack didn't stop. It was like I was dropping a fishing line into an abyss. I looked down at the entry puncture. The thick, coarse linen wasn't gathering the skin together, it was being drawn downward, disappearing into the dark, vertical slice of her chest with a slow, smooth, hydraulic tension. It looked exactly like she was swallowing the thread, boss. What the hell? I muttered, dropping the shears. I reached out with my bare fingers, grabbing the flax line right where it entered the skin. The moment my skin touched that thread, a shock of absolute, predatory cold shot up my arm, so violent it made my elbow lock. The thread wasn't dead, boss. It was vibrating. It had a faint, rapid pulse running through it, a geometric tremor that felt exactly like a tiny, wet heart beating 60 times a minute inside the linen fibers. I pulled back, trying to yank the needle free, but the loop was stuck. The skin around the puncture had puckered, turning a dark, bruised purple as it clamped down on the steel needle like a mouth closing over a coin. Then, the first 3 stitches I'd completed at the top of her throat began to shift. They didn't break. The thick linen knots didn't give way. Instead, the borders of the skin began to peel back with a dry, stretching sound, *CRRK, *CRRK*, like wet leather being torn from a saddle. The vertical laceration opened up an inch wide, exposing the dark, empty cavity where her lungs should have been. But it wasn't empty anymore. Through the narrow gap in the flesh, I could see the packing linen I'd stuffed inside her chest earlier. The white gauze was completely soaked in a thick, black condensation that wasn't blood. It was moving, shifting under the yellow lantern light like a nest of wet earthworms. And from the dark throat of that opening, the breath came again. It wasn't a mechanical vent this time, boss. It was a rhythmic, dual-pulsed inhalation. *Hisshuck. Hisshuck, *a wet, suffocating gasp that rattled the deep interior of her rib cage, forcing a thick plume of gray, carbolic-scented frost straight up into my face. Beneath that wet rattle, a sound began to form. A voice. It was faint, muffled by the layers of dead tissue, but it carried a flat, familiar cadence that made my knees turn to water. "Artie," the voice scraped out from behind her cold teeth. *Artie, the water is so cold down by the creek, why didn't you look for me? Asterisk. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. That wasn't Jane Doe's voice. That belonged to Billy Vance, a kid I used to fish with back in the summer of '63, a kid who had vanished into the Blackwater Ravine when we were 12 and was found 3 weeks later, bloated and ruined by the current. My hands flew back, the heavy wooden chair behind me scraping across the damp concrete with a screech that sounded like a dying animal. I hit the brick wall hard, my shoulder blade slamming into the cold, sweating mortar. My eyes were locked on the zinc table, wide and paralyzed. Billy Vance. That name hadn't crossed my lips in 15 years, boss. The county cops had called it a tragic misadventure back in '63. They said he slipped off the old logging bridge into the Blackwater Ravine during the spring thaw. I still remembered his face at the funeral, or what was left of it after the snapper turtles and the river silt had done their work. The casket had been sealed tight. No open wake. No final look. Just a heavy pine box dropping into the wet Illinois mud while his mother screamed into her handkerchief. And now, his exact voice, that soft, slightly nasal rural cadence, was leaking out from the butchered chest of a Jane Doe found in the woods 6 hours ago. "This ain't happening," I whispered, my palms pressing flat against the wet brick behind me. "The fumes, the formalin is getting to my brain. I'm having a psychotic break." I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to force the rational, cold logic of a medical worker back into my skull. The human brain under extreme fatigue can play horrific tricks, boss. Working 12-hour shifts in a basement filled with chemical preservatives while a thunderstorm models a vacuum outside, it's a perfect recipe for auditory hallucinations. But a hallucination doesn't change the physical architecture of a corpse. Under the trembling, oily glare of the lantern, the thick linen threads I'd stitched into her flesh began to tighten further. The knot at the base of her neck was pulled so taut it began to cut through the gray skin like a wire cheese slicer, leaving deep, purple trenches in the dead meat. The flax line didn't break, it hummed with a tight, high-frequency mechanical vibration that rattled the zinc table. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk. The drainage plates in the center of the floorboards gave 2 sharp, metallic thuds. It wasn't water backing up from the storm. It was a rhythmic, pressurized knock that resonated straight through my boots, matching the exact dual-pulsed cadence coming from the corpse's chest. Asterisk hisshuck. Hisshuck, asterisk. Jane Doe's right arm, a cold, heavy limb that had been resting flat against her side in full rigor mortis, began to rotate. It wasn't a smooth, muscular movement. It was a jerky, jointed, hydraulic mechanical sequence, like the arm of an old steam shovel being jacked up by internal pressure. The gray fingers twitched, the nails scraping against the zinc rim with a dry, terrifying skrrch. Then, the vertical incision across her breastbone stretched open another 2 inches. The white packing gauze inside her thoracic cavity was completely black now, saturated with a thick, greasy condensation that looked like old engine oil. The dark gap in the skin shifted, folding over itself like a pair of wet leather lips, and a second voice erupted from the meat. "Arthur." This voice was older, raspy, and carried the heavy tobacco rattle of a man who smoked 2 packs of unfiltered Luckies a day. Asterisk, the return line is blocked, Artie. The heat is building in the lower hold. You gotta clear the sediment. It's choking us. Asterisk. My breath hitched in my throat, the air turning to absolute ice in my lungs. That was my Uncle Silas. He died in a boiler explosion at the local starch processing plant down in Decatur 5 years back. They found him inside the pressurized steam chamber, cooked so badly his clothes had fused to his skin. "Stop it," I whimpered, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy steel bone set shears on the side rack. Get the hell away from her. The corpse's head didn't turn to look at me, boss. It stayed fixed, staring straight up at the damp ceiling pipes. But the lips, those blue, rigid lips, began to part, stretching so wide at the corners that the dry skin split, leaking a clear, yellowish serous fluid that trickled down her chin. From both openings at once, the mouth and the chest, the voices began to braid together, a dual-pulsed, mechanical choir of the dead that filled the small basement until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the frequency of a closed furnace. Asterisk, the needle opens the eye, Arthur. The thread closes the loop. Finish the seam. We want out. Asterisk. The air in the basement went flat, boss. The heavy, sulfurous stench of old wood smoke and wet carbolic wash expanded so fast it pressed against my eardrums with a sickening, pneumatic pop. The yellow flame of the oil lantern shrank down to a tiny, greasy blue bead, drowning in the sudden, pressurized humidity that was rolling off the zinc table. I was pinned against that damp brick wall, my fingers white as chalk around the handles of the heavy steel bone-set shears. Finish the seam, the braided voices kept scraping out from the split skin of Jane Doe's chest, a dual-pulsed chorus of people I'd buried years ago, all wrapped up in the mechanical rhythm of that wet hiss-shuck. Asterisk hiss-shuck. Hiss-shuck, asterisk. Every textbook I'd ever read about post-mortem mechanics was completely useless now. A corpse under standard rigor mortis requires immense, manual force to move. The lactic acid locks the muscle fibers like concrete. But Jane Doe's body wasn't moving under its own power, boss. It was being operated. The thick flax thread I'd sewn into her flesh was acting like a system of hydraulic cables, drawing her shoulders together and pulling her spine off the table in a stiff, jointed arch. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk. The iron drainage plates in the concrete floor rattled again, and this time, a thick, dark condensation began to bubble up through the small square holes. It wasn't storm water. It was a greasy, silver-gray liquid that smelled heavily of boiled starch and river silt, spreading across the floorboards in perfectly straight, geometric lines that ignored the natural slope of the basement. The cold that hit the room wasn't just a drop in temperature, boss. It was a predatory vacuum. It sucked the warmth right out of my clothes, turning my wool shirt into a stiff, freezing layer that stuck to my back. Artie. Uncle Silas's tobacco-rattled rasp rose above the static. The valve is stripping its thread. Look at the pressure gauge. Instinctively, my eyes darted to the old copper boiler at the back of the coal bin, a massive, 80-year-old steam furnace that used to heat the upper floors of St. Jude's Municipal Building. The furnace had been disconnected since the winter of '68, its iron pipes rusted through and cut off from the main line. But the needle on the circular brass pressure gauge wasn't dead. It was vibrating, passing the red warning line and pinning itself against the safety stop with a sharp, rhythmic tink-tink-tink. The glass face of the gauge was frosting over from the center outward, forming the unmistakable, geometric outline of a five-fingered hand pressing against the dial from the inside out. Jane Doe's fingers scraped the edge of the zinc table again, the gray skin on her knuckles cracking open under the immense, internal tension. The thick linen thread hanging from her chest wound began to whip through the air. It wasn't loose anymore, it was rigid as a steel wire, spinning in tiny, rapid circles that made a high-pitched, drilling hiss, asterisk VRRT, VRRT, VRRT asterisk, like an industrial sewing machine operating at maximum speed in the dark. The vertical incision across her sternum split wide open, the dark borders of the skin peeling back all the way to her ribs. The black packing linen inside her thoracic cavity flared with a faint, phosphorescent silver light, casting long, skeletal shadows against the brick pillars of the vault. And then, the entity inside the meat began to look for the exit. The waxy, white outlines of dozens of shifting faces began to fold over and over into themselves within the open chest cavity, their features appearing for a fraction of a second before being crushed back into the pressurized mass of the gray vapor. They weren't just shouting anymore, boss. They were drawing the very atmosphere out of the room, forcing it into the open eye of my curved steel needle to complete the circuit. I raised the bone-set shears with both hands, my arms trembling so hard the steel blades chattered together. "Get back down," I choked out, my voice sounding flat and muffled through the dense, carbolic air. "Get back in the ground." The rigid, wire-like strand of flax thread shot forward from her chest, wound with an explosive speed that defied gravity, aiming straight for my face like a pressurized iron cable. The strand of flax thread didn't hit me like wet string, boss. It whipped through the air with the sharp, mechanical twang of a snapped elevator cable. I ducked instinctively, throwing my weight to the left. The rigid linen wire sliced through the dark inches from my ear, striking the damp brick wall behind me with a sickening, concrete-chipping crack. The impact left a deep, white gouge in the 80-year-old mortar, and the thread didn't slacken. It stayed taut, vibrating between the wall and Jane Doe's open chest like a high-tension power line. Asterisk hiss-shuck. Hiss-shuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed roar from her hollowed-out rib cage exploded in volume, turning into a deafening, industrial scream that rattled my teeth against my jaw. The air pressure in the basement dropped instantly, hitting my eardrums with a violent, agonizing pop that made my vision blur. The single brass oil lantern on the edge of the table gave a dying spit. The yellow flame vanished, replaced by an absolute, freezing blackness that seemed to pour out of the corpse's split sternum like heavy oil. The only light left was that faint, phosphorescent silver glow pulsing from the greasy condensation inside her thoracic cavity, casting long, geometric shadows that bent at unnatural angles across the ceiling pipes. "The room is sealing," I gasped, but the words were instantly sucked out of my mouth. Every time I tried to draw a breath, my lungs burned with a dry, restricted heat, smelling heavily of scorched wool, stale carbolic wash, and the unmistakable rot of an old hospital ward. The oxygen was being violently evacuated, drawn directly into the vacuum engine building inside the dead woman's frame. Beside the zinc table, the heavy iron drainage plates on the floorboards began to screech. The silver-gray liquid that had bubbled up from the sewers was spinning in a tight, rapid vortex around the legs of the table, drawn toward the center of the room by an impossible hydraulic pull. Through the silver-gray mist rising off the floor, Jane Doe's body began to slide. The rigor mortis didn't just break, it completely dissolved as the shifting mass of waxy, white outlines inside her chest expanded under immense hydraulic tension. Her elongated limbs stretched outward, the gray fingers reaching toward the walls as her spine twisted into a sickening, U-shaped arch that lifted her torso clear off the metal surface. "Artie," Billy Vance's nasal voice was layered beneath a dozen other rattling throats now, all of them speaking in a synchronized, flat cadence. Asterisk, "The needle is the valve, Artie. The thread is the return line. You left the loop open. You have to finish the seam so we can breathe. Asterisk. You're dead, Billy." I screamed into the dark, my fingers numb and white as I gripped the heavy steel bone-set shears. "You're all under the mud." I didn't think. My medical rationality disintegrated under the weight of that absolute, predatory cold. I lunged forward through the silver fog, raising the heavy shears with both hands, aiming straight for the taut, vibrating flax line connecting her chest to the brick wall. Snap! The steel blades bit into the coarse linen wire. A shower of tiny, freezing blue sparks erupted from the cut, stinging my face and tasting like raw copper on my tongue. The thread severed, the two ends whipping back into the darkness with a violent hiss. The moment the connection broke, the wet static inside her chest flared into a high-pitched, drilling whine that made my ears bleed. The white, pressurized ropes of vapor didn't dissipate, they erupted outward from the open incision with explosive speed, shooting across the 10-foot gap straight for my ankles. Before I could kick myself free, a freezing shackle of braided frost closed around my left boot, drawing tight with a sharp, sickening tension that felt like it would snap the bone clean through the leather. The moment the freezing shackle of braided frost clamped around my left ankle, it didn't feel like a simple cold bite, it felt like a hydraulic iron vise being wrenched tight by a heavy-duty diesel engine. The leather of my work boot didn't just freeze, it split down the seam with a sharp, paper-like crack as the moisture within the thick hide instantly crystallized into white needles. A violent, localized winter raced up my leg, turning the muscle to rigid stone and locking my knee before the signal of agony could even clear my central nervous system. I fell hard, my shoulder slamming against the wet, sticky concrete floorboards with an impact that knocked the wind clean out of my lungs. The heavy steel bone-set shears went skittering into the dark mirror of the silver-gray fluid that was spinning around the room, out of reach. "Boss," I choked out, my voice sounding flat, thin, and miles away through the dense, pneumatic pressure of the sealed basement. The air in the vault was almost entirely gone now, replaced by an administrative, absolute cold that turned my every breath into a ragged gasp for air through wet sheets. Every time I tried to draw oxygen, I could feel a dense, metallic condensation settling in the bottom of my lungs, heavy as liquid mercury, making my chest rattle with the exact same dual-pulsed cadence that filled the room. Asterisk Hisshuck. Hisshuck, asterisk. Jane Doe's body was hovering over the zinc table now, her spine twisted into that impossible, jointed arch as the white, canvas-like ropes of vapor under immense tension began to drag me backward toward the center of the floorboards. My right boot scraped uselessly against the frozen concrete, trying to find a grip in the greasy slime. I was being pulled directly toward her split chest cavity, where the waxy white faces of the dead were folding over each other like a nest of maggots, their hollow eyes staring down at my throat. Above us, the heavy copper pipes of the old 68 boiler system began to turn red. Not from heat, but from an impossible, glowing phosphorescence that pulsed in time with the entity's breath. The 64 pairs of ruined lungs were drawing the very atmosphere out of the room, forcing it into the open eye of the curved steel needle to seal the circuit permanently. The furnace. I wheezed, my fingers clawing at the concrete as my leg was dragged another foot closer to the table. The return line. With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, I didn't try to pull away from the shackle. Instead, I used my free right leg to kick against the iron frame of the zinc table, throwing my entire weight sideways toward the back of the coal bin where the old boiler controls sat in the dark. My outstretched hand hit the cold, rusted iron of the main intake valve, the big, circular well that had been frozen shut since the plant down in Decatur blew its headers 5 years ago. The iron was sub-zero, but I didn't pull back. The skin of my palm hissed as it touched the metal, the frost instantly bonding my flesh to the wheel. With a guttural, desperate scream, I threw my entire body weight downward against the valve, forcing my dead left leg to brace against the floorboards. Clang shuck. The rusted wheel gave way, turning 3 full rotations as the dry, internal thread sheared off with a sound like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The old, dry vacuum lines of the building's heating system didn't just vent, they roared. The sudden shift in temperature caused the geometric lines of the entity to flicker and distort, its waxy, white fingers unraveling into loose, unpressurized plumes of harmless gray steam as the external air from the upper floors was violently drawn down the intake pipes to equalize the pressure. The freezing shackle around my ankle snapped. I kicked myself free, scrambling backward on my hands and knees into the cold dust as the air rushed back into my burning lungs. Through the darkness, the dense, suffocating silence of the night returned, leaving me gasping in the dark, surrounded by nothing but the faint, dying hiss of the empty pipes. The rush of external air through the old boiler vents didn't feel like a rescue, boss, it felt like a violent extraction. The sudden equalization of pressure hit my ears with a sharp, sickening pop, leaving a high-pitched, electronic ringing in my head that drowned out even the sound of my own ragged, whistling breathing. I lay sprawled in the black coal dust and wet slime of the basement floor, my left leg entirely numb from the knee down, staring up through the swirling gray mist at the dark timber ceiling joists. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing moved. The only sound was the cold Illinois wind howling upstairs, carrying with it the clean, damp scent of mud and cornfields, a stark, blessed contrast to the sulphurous, carbolic stench of the closed loop that had almost choked the life out of me. "Get up, Arthur," I wheezed to myself, dragging my body away from the shadow of the zinc table. My fingers were bleeding where the frozen skin had been torn away by the iron boiler wheel, leaving raw, red tracks across my palms. I rubbed my numb ankle, trying to force the circulation back into the white, waxy flesh beneath my split leather boot. The muscle protested with a sharp, tearing ache, but the bone was intact. The connection was broken. I looked toward the center of the vault. The phosphorescent silver glow had vanished, plunging the basement back into a coal-black gloom illuminated only by the tiny, dying blue bead of the oil lantern. Jane Doe number 44 lay flat on the zinc table once more. Her spine had settled back into its natural, heavy post-mortem state. Her arms were limp at her sides. The vertical incision across her breastbone was dark and still, no longer mimicking the shape of a mouth, no longer breathing that wet, rhythmic hiss-shuck. But the room wasn't the same, boss. The yellowed walls of the vault were completely soaked, the damp lime wash running down the brickwork in steady, vertical streams like grease. The floor was covered in a thin, silver-gray film of carbolic condensation that didn't evaporate, keeping the air at a steady, absolute zero that made my eyelashes heavy with frost. I dragged myself up using the edge of a supply cabinet, my eyes locked on the corpse. I knew the rules of the county morgue inside and out, boss. I knew how bodies behaved. But what happened down here tonight wasn't a biological anomaly. It was an engineering problem. I limped over to the desk near the elevator shaft and picked up the clipboard containing the county intake log. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled against the aluminum board. I pulled the oil lantern closer, its weak flame casting an amber ring over the typed records from the sheriff's department. Jane Doe 44. Found near the Blackwater Ravine. No identification. No personal effects. But my mind didn't see the typed text. It saw the names that had leaked out of her chest. Billy Vance. Uncle Silas. People who had been taken by the water and the steam years ago, miles apart from each other, but linked by the same mechanical, pressurized end. "The loop is still open," I whispered, the cold air turning my voice into a thick plume of gray soot. The thread I'd used to sew her up didn't belong to her, boss. It was coarse flax thread I'd pulled from the supply drawer, the same drawer that had been sitting in this basement since St. Jude's was built over the old town foundry back in the 50s. Suddenly, the tiny blue bead of the lantern flame didn't just flicker, it froze, its tongue locking into a rigid, glass-like triangle. The sudden, biting chill that hit the room didn't come from the vents. It rose directly from the floorboards beneath the table, carrying with it a faint, sibilant vibration that sounded like 64 pairs of ruined lungs drawing a collective breath through a single, narrow pipe. Out in the corridor, the heavy steel doors of the morgue elevator gave a sharp, metallic clang. The heavy steel doors of the morgue elevator didn't open, boss. They just shuddered against their iron tracks, giving off a dry, ungreased shuck-shuck sound that echoed all the way up the concrete shaft. The mechanical cables inside the brick wall groaned under a sudden, dead-weight tension, vibrating so hard that flakes of rusted iron dust rained down onto the floorboards like black salt. I stood there by the desk, my raw, bandaged hands gripping the edges of the aluminum clipboard until the metal bent under my fingers. My left leg was still dragging, a cold, arthritic ache pinning my ankle to the wet floor. "The power's dead," I muttered, my voice sounding flat and trapped in the freezing air. "There ain't no way that carriage is moving." But the cables kept singing. Asterisk taut. Rigged. Screaming, asterisk. I didn't run for the stairs, boss. In my line of work, you learn real quick that running in the dark just gets you a broken neck against a concrete riser. Instead, I pulled open the deep bottom drawer of the county desk. It was jammed with old, water-damaged municipal records, tax ledgers from the late 50s, and a rolled-up set of structural blueprints for St. Jude's municipal basement, dated 1954. I unrolled the thick blue paper across the desk, pinning the curling corners down with 2 heavy jars of formaldehyde. I raised the dying oil lantern, its frozen, glass-like flame casting a weak, blue-tinted halo over the white schematic lines. My eyes traced the layout of the vault, past the zinc tables, past the coal bin, straight to the back wall where the old '68 boiler stood. But the blueprints didn't stop at the brick foundation, boss. Right beneath the concrete slab where my feet were standing, the architect had drawn a massive, auxiliary network of underground channels, a closed-circuit drainage line labeled St. Jude Municipal Foundry Return, Closed Condensation Loop. It wasn't a sewage line, I whispered, the realization hitting my stomach like a bucket of ice water. It was an intake reservoir. Back in '54, before this place became a county morgue, it was a specialized industrial processing plant. When the old town foundry suffered that massive pressure failure in the lower boilers, 64 workers had been trapped in the pressurized sub-basement. The state closed the factory, sealed the lower chambers with 5 feet of solid slag, and built the municipal building right over their bones. The flax thread I'd been using to stitch the corpses wasn't new, boss. It was old industrial stock, salvaged from the foundry's leftover supply crates in the lower storeroom. Every time I drew that curved needle through a body's skin, I wasn't just fixing a corpse for an open casket. I was threading a wire. I was connecting the dead on the table to the 64 boiler-heated souls compressed inside the pressurized vacuum beneath the floorboards. Jane Doe 44 wasn't a victim of a hit-and-run. She had been found near the Blackwater Ravine because that's where the main atmospheric exhaust valve for the old foundry loop leaked into the woods. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk. The elevator doors rattled again, the iron panels buckling inward an inch as if a massive, hydraulic piston was pressing against them from the dark interior of the shaft. Through the narrow gap between the sliding doors, a thick, braided column of white steam began to hiss into the corridor. It didn't rise to the ceiling joists, boss. It flowed downward, a heavy, crawling vapor that hugged the concrete, expanding with that rapid, geometric precision I'd seen on the zinc table. And from the dark throat of the elevator shaft, Uncle Silas's tobacco-rattled voice came screaming through the iron grid, louder and closer than before. Asterisk Arthur. The safety valve is stripped. The whole circuit is backing up. Clear the line, Artie, or the boiler is gonna take the whole county down. Asterisk. The scream that tore through the elevator shaft didn't sound like a human throat, boss. It sounded like the high-pitched, agonizing whistle of a high-pressure steam line pushed 20 bars past its structural limit. The sound was so loud it didn't just hurt my ears, it shook my teeth in their sockets and made the grease on the zinc table ripple in tiny, concentric circles. The braided column of white steam pushing through the elevator doors wasn't hot either. It was that same predatory, sub-zero vapor that smelled of scorched linen and river silt. It hit the floorboards and expanded instantly, a heavy, knee-high current of white fog that raced across the concrete with a terrifying, hydraulic speed. Asterisk Hisshuck. Hisshuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed cadence was inside the very masonry now. The brick walls of the vault began to sweat a dark, oily moisture that froze the second it touched the air, turning the yellowed paint into a checkerboard of cracked, crystalline frost. "The loop is backing up," I gasped, my breath freezing into a thick gray plume that was immediately sucked toward the elevator shaft by a sudden, violent change in the room's air pressure. I scrambled away from the desk, dragging my numb left leg behind me like a sack of coal. My boots slipped on the wet concrete as the silver-gray fluid from the drains began to rise, swirling around my ankles in a tight, geometric vortex that ignored every law of gravity. I looked back at Jane Doe 44. She wasn't resting anymore, boss. The massive internal pressure building beneath the floorboards was venting straight up through the zinc table's central drainage pipe. The force of the vacuum lifted her heavy, gray torso off the metal slab, her arms snapping out to the sides with a loud, jointed crack as the rigor mortis was violently shattered by the expansion of the air inside her tissues. The vertical incision across her chest split wide open, not 2 inches this time, but all the way from her throat to her pubic bone. The skin boundaries peeled back like the leather flaps of an old suitcase, exposing the dark, empty cavity where her lungs should have been. But it wasn't empty. Through the roaring silver fog, I could see the 64 waxy white faces woven directly into the fabric of the wet steam inside her chest. Their hollow, frozen eyes were spinning in a rapid, synchronized motion, their blue lips moving in absolute silence as they drew the very atmosphere out of the vault to feed the pressure gauge at the back of the coal bin. "Arthur," Billy Vance's voice rose above the industrial static, his nasal tone now layered with the wet, rattling gasps of dozens of men who had died with coal dust and steam in their throats. Asterisk, the needle opened the gate, Artie. But the seam ain't finished. You left the wire hanging. Asterisk. The long, loose strand of flax thread I'd severed with the shears was still stuck to the wall's brickwork. Under the yellow glare of the dying lantern, that thread began to whip through the freezing air like a living wire, its thick linen fibers spinning so fast they made a high-pitched, drilling hiss, asterisk VRRT, VRRT, VRRT asterisk, that sounded like an industrial loom gone completely off the tracks. The wire shot forward from the wall, aiming straight for the open, split flesh of Jane Doe's collarbone to lock the circuit back into place. If that thread completed the loop, boss, the pressure wouldn't just disintegrate the corpse, it would ground the entire potential of that 1954 foundry disaster right into this basement, burying me under 5 feet of freezing, pressurized slag. "I ain't finishing your seam," I growled through my chattering teeth. I lunged through the silver fog, my raw hand scraping against the concrete as I searched for the heavy steel boneset shears I'd dropped earlier. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy handle just as the wire-like thread sliced through the dark inches above my head, striking the zinc table with a metallic ping that sent a shower of freezing blue sparks straight into my eyes. The room went completely dark as the lantern flame drowned in the humidity, leaving me in an absolute, phosphorescent silver hell. The darkness that followed the lantern's death was total, boss, but it wasn't empty. It was a thick, breathing blackness that felt like being buried alive in a silo full of wet grain. The only light left in the entire county morgue was the faint, phosphorescent silver rot pulsing from the open chest cavity of Jane Doe 44. It flickered in time with that deafening, dual-pulsed industrial roar, asterisk Hisshuck asterisk, casting long, skeletal ribs of white light across the sweating concrete ceiling. I lay flat on my stomach in the wet cold dust, my left hand gripping the heavy steel boneset shears, my right hand pressed against the frozen floorboards. The silver-gray fluid rising from the drains was up to my chest now, freezing cold and greasy as lard, spinning me in a slow, hydraulic circle toward the center of the vault. "Arthur." Uncle Silas's voice didn't come from the elevator shaft this time, boss. It came from the water beneath me. It vibrated straight through my ribs, his tobacco-rattled rasp sounding like it was trapped inside my own throat. Asterisk, the needle is passing the red line, Artie. The headers are expanding. If you don't vent the return line right now, the whole foundation is gonna lift. Asterisk. I looked up through the stinging, carbolic mist. Jane Doe's body was suspended 3 feet above the zinc table now, held aloft by the sheer, kinetic force of the pressurized steam venting from the floor drain. Her limbs were jerking in tight, geometric patterns, her gray fingers snapping shut and opening like the valves of a high-pressure manifold. The long, loose strand of flax thread, the one I'd cut, was vibrating in mid-air between the brick wall and her open sternum, hummed so tight it looked like a rod of solid gray iron. The wire was trying to thread itself back into her collarbone to complete the loop, boss. Every time the linen fibers brushed against her dead flesh, a loud, static crack echoed through the room, throwing off blue sparks that smelled like burnt hair and sulfur. "You want a vent?" I wheezed, my lungs screaming for dry air as the vacuum pressure squeezed my chest like a metal band. "I'll give you a damn vent." I didn't try to fight the current drawing me toward the table. I used the momentum, rolling my body through the freezing slime until my shoulder slammed hard against the rusted iron leg of the prep table. The impact sent a bolt of agony straight through my bad knee, but I ignored it. I reached up into the dark, my fingers searching the greasy underside of the zinc slab. I knew the architecture of these tables by heart, boss. Every municipal prep table built in the 50s had a central 2-inch brass cleanout plug directly beneath the drainage funnel, a heavy, threaded cap used to clear out the solid sediment and post-mortem debris that didn't wash down the standard line. My bleeding palm found the cold, hexagonal nut of the plug. It was encrusted with decades of dried formalin and lime wash, frozen solid by the absolute zero temperature of the room. I raised the heavy steel boneset shears with my right hand, using the solid metal handle as a makeshift hammer. Clang! The blow vibrated up my arm, splitting the skin over my knuckles. The plug didn't budge. The entity inside Jane Doe's chest let out a high-pitched, drilling whine that made my nose bleed again, a warm, thick drop of copper hitting the cold water below. The waxy white faces inside her ribs twisted in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto me through the silver fog. The iron-hard flax thread began to lower itself, the sharp needle end aiming straight for the center of my forehead to drive the circuit home. "Turn, you bastard," I growled, setting my teeth. I wedged the thick blades of the boneset shears directly into the narrow notch of the brass plug, using both hands to create a heavy leverage bar. I threw my entire weight downward, forcing my numb legs to find purchase against the slippery concrete. Crack-shuck. The old brass thread sheared. The clean-out plug dropped into the rising fluid with a heavy splash. The release of pressure wasn't a leak, boss, it was a localized explosion. A towering, braided geyser of freezing, black sediment and high-pressure steam erupted straight down out of the bottom of the table, hitting the concrete floor with a concussive roar that blew the silver-gray vortex completely apart. The vacuum inside the vault fractured, the sudden pressure drop hitting my chest like a physical fist, drawing the cold air clean out of my lungs as the circuit was violently, mechanically broken from below. The concussive blow of that pressure drop didn't just break the circuit, boss, it felt like the entire concrete floor of St. Jude's municipal basement had been kicked from below by a literal iron boot. The geyser of black, frozen sediment erupting down through the table's clean-out hole hit the concrete slab with a deafening, industrial thud-thud-thud that sent a blinding shockwave of icy sludge straight into my face. The grease and carbolic slime I'd been drowning in didn't just drain, it was violently, magnetically sucked down into the opening, pulled by the immense, terrifying gravity of the old 1954 foundry loop beneath our feet. Hiss shuck. Hiss shuck. The dual-pulsed roar from Jane Doe's chest didn't stop, but the frequency changed. It went from a predatory, controlled mechanical rhythm to a frantic, erratic stammer, the sound of an engine whose main drive shaft had just snapped at 5,000 RPMs. With the brass cleanout plug gone, the table acted as a massive, upside-down funnel. The air density inside the vault shifted so fast my ears gave a sharp, bloody pop, and the thick, yellow-black fog that had been rolling down from the elevator shaft was suddenly dragged toward the zinc table in a violent, swirling vortex. "Artie!" Uncle Silas's voice didn't rattle through the water anymore. It was a high, drilling shriek that echoed out from the split skin of the corpse's throat. "The manifold is splitting. The return line is dry. You're venting the main chamber." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was pinned on my back against the rusted iron leg of the table, my fingers clawing at the metal braces to keep from being drawn into the black hole of the drainage funnel. Through the silver-gray mist, I looked up. Jane Doe's body was dropping. Without the vertical pressure from the floor plates to keep her floating, her heavy, gray frame descended with a jerky, jointed deceleration, her spine popping as it slammed back onto the zinc slab with a wet, heavy thud. But the entity inside the meat wasn't done, boss. The long, loose strand of flax thread, the one I'd severed, was still whipping through the dark like a piece of live wire. The linen fibers had unraveled at the tip, forming dozens of tiny, gray tendrils that panted and twitched in the carbolic air. Driven by the dying vacuum, the thread made one final, desperate lunge through the dark, aiming straight for the open, unzipped tissue of her neck to force the loop closed before the pressure reached absolute zero. "No you don't," I wheezed. I raised my right arm, my muscles trembling so hard the bones felt like glass, and threw the heavy steel bone set shears straight into the center of the table. Clang! The heavy steel shears didn't cut the line this time. They landed perfectly across the brass rim of the drainage hole, pinning the thick, loose tail of the flax thread directly beneath the cold metal handle. The moment the thread was pinned against the structural metal of the table, the grounding loop completed itself, but not the way the 64 wanted. The table was connected directly to the building's main iron water pipes, which ran 20 feet deep into the solid, wet Illinois mud. A brilliant, blinding flash of blue static sparkon erupted from the zinc surface, tasting like raw copper and battery acid on my tongue. The wire-like thread didn't just snap, it flared with a sharp, white phosphorescence and instantly disintegrated into a fine, harmless layer of gray soot that was swept straight down the open drain. The 64 voices gave one collective, deafening gasp, a sound like a wet sheet being torn in half by a gale-force wind, and then, the roaring static in the walls died. The silence that returned to the basement was immediate, heavy, and absolute, broken only by the steady, natural dripping of muddy storm water from the main return valve over the coal bin. Jane Doe 44 lay flat on the metal, her skin no longer blue, but a flat, pale, natural post-mortem gray. The vertical incision across her chest was still open, but the waxy white faces were gone, leaving behind nothing but the dark, empty cavity and the wet, scentless layers of linen gauze I'd packed inside her 6 hours ago. I lay there in the dark coal dust, my chest heaving as the clean, freezing rain from the county streets began to pour down through the open boiler vents to fill the void. One more chapter to go, boss. The final loop. Tell me when you're ready to lock this video down. The silence that followed was different from the quiet I was used to, boss. It wasn't the heavy, stagnant peace of a county morgue, it was the hollow, ringing silence that hits a factory floor after the main generators are suddenly cut off. The air density inside the vault equalized with a final, low-frequency hum that vibrated the fillings in my teeth, leaving behind only the cold, sharp scent of an Illinois rainstorm. I lay in the cold dust for what felt like hours, watching my own breath form slow, natural clouds that drifted up toward the ceiling pipes without being sucked into the dark. My left leg was a throbbing knot of white-hot pain, but the ice had melted. The circulation was back. Slowly, using the lip of the zinc table for leverage, I dragged myself to my feet. Jane Doe number 44 didn't look like an engine anymore. She was just clay. The immense internal static that had stretched her skin like cured leather was entirely gone. Her jaw had dropped naturally, her blue lips slightly parted, no longer leaking that clear, yellowish serous fluid. I looked down into the open funnel of the drain beneath the table. Far below, in the deep black channels of the 1954 foundry return loop, I could hear the last of the silver-gray fluid gurgling away, draining out into the deep mud of the Blackwater ravine where the county line ended. The 64 souls weren't screaming anymore. The pressure had dropped. The circuit was grounded. I picked up my curved steel needle from the floor. The tip was black with soot, the steel slightly warped from the kinetic force of that final blue static flash. "The ledger is balanced," I whispered, my voice dry as paper in the empty vault. I walked over to the supply drawer, pulled out a fresh spool of the standard, modern nylon thread, the clean, white stuff the county bought from Chicago, and sat back down on my stool. My hands were shaking, my palms raw and bandaged with strips of packing gauze, but the work didn't care about my pain. The funeral home limousine was scheduled to arrive at 5 o'clock in the morning, and Jane Doe still needed to be presentable. Asterisk Pierce. Pull. Not asterisk. The modern thread didn't make that dry, scraping shuck-shuck sound. It was smooth. It was quiet. With precise, steady movements, I began to close the massive, vertical incision running from her throat down to her hip joints. One stitch at a time, I aligned the gray borders of the skin, locking the flesh down with clean, bureaucratic knots that didn't vibrate, didn't pulse, and didn't hold a charge. By the time the final knot was tied and the shears snipped the excess nylon, the small, ground-level windows of the basement were turning a faint, dirty gray. The storm outside had broken, leaving nothing but a steady, rhythmic drizzle against the mud. Upstairs, the heavy municipal lights gave a loud, sudden buzz hum as the county power grid finally came back online. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered, then caught, flooding the room with a cold, sterile white light that washed out every shadow in the brick corners. I stood up, packed my instruments back into the carbolic jar, and pulled a clean, white linen sheet over Jane Doe's face. As I walked toward the elevator, the steel doors now resting quietly on their tracks, I stopped by the old copper boiler at the back of the coal bin. The circular brass pressure gauge was completely dead now. The needle had dropped all the way back to zero, resting flat against the metal pin. The glass face was still cracked, but the frost was gone, replaced by a thin, ordinary layer of condensation that was slowly dripping down onto the rusted floor plates. I stepped into the elevator carriage and pressed the button for the street level. As the old iron cage began to rise, lifting me out of the dark, I looked down one last time through the floor grids at the concrete slab below. The basement looked clean under the fluorescent light, almost normal. But let me tell you something, boss. When you spend your night stitching the dead back together, you learn that every city is built over an engine. Every town has a closed loop, a forgotten boiler, or a buried seam waiting under the concrete. And sooner or later, when the rain hits the right cadence and the valves begin to strip, the pressure always finds a way back up.